It was the year 1939. The world stood at the edge of chaos, a fragile peace, hanging by a thread. The scars of the First World War had not yet healed, and yet, a new storm was brewing. Across Europe, dark ideologies began to rise once again, fueled by hate, hunger, and the hunger for power. Germany, under the command of Adolf Hitler, was rebuilding itself not just with weapons, but with anger. The Treaty of Versailles had left the German people humiliated, broken, and desperate. Hitler used that pain like firewood, igniting a movement that promised glory, revenge, and the restoration of a fallen empire. Meanwhile, the world watched silently. Britain and France hoped that diplomacy could stop the madness. The United States stayed distant, trapped in the illusion that this war would not reach their shores. But deep inside, the signs were clear. Humanity was heading towards its darkest hour. In September 1939, the silence finally shattered. Germany invaded Poland with the speed and ferocity the world had never seen. This was Blitzkrieg lightning war. Tanks roared across fields, planes screamed through the skies, and cities turned to dust within hours. Civilians fled in terror, soldiers fell by the thousands, and a new kind of warfare was born, fast, ruthless, and merciless. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but it was already too late. Poland was crushed. Its people became the first victims of a conflict that would soon engulf the entire planet. But behind the battlefield, another kind of war had begun, a war for the soul of mankind. Hitler's ideology was more than conquest. It was an assault on humanity itself. He believed in a world divided by race, where only the pure deserved to live. Millions would pay the price for that belief. As Europe burned, families were torn apart, children lost their homes, and the sky itself seemed to mourn. In those moments of horror, small acts of courage began to shine. A soldier helping a wounded enemy, a mother protecting strangers, a resistance fighter risking everything for freedom. This was no longer just a war between nations. It was the battle for humanity. September 1 Street, 1939. The world changed forever. As dawn broke, the German war machine unleashed its fury on Poland. The sky roared with the sound of dive bombers, and the ground trembled under the weight of advancing tanks. Civilians watched in horror as their homes turned to ruins within hours. The once peaceful cities of Warsaw and Krakow became the first battlegrounds of a new and terrifying kind of war. The German Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Coordinated airstrikes, tank assaults, and fast-moving infantry units worked together like a deadly symphony. Within days, Poland's defenses were shattered. The soldiers fought bravely, often with outdated weapons, facing an enemy armed with modern machines and ruthless tactics. But Poland's tragedy did not come from Germany alone. Just weeks later, from the east, Soviet forces invaded under a secret pact with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It was a silent agreement to divide Poland in two. The Polish people were trapped between two brutal powers, both determined to erase their nation from the map. By the end of September, Poland had fallen, its army destroyed, its government in exile, and its people under occupation. The world watched, stunned and afraid. Britain and France had declared war, but their armies stood still. No help came, no army marched, only silence followed the screams of the dying. For the Polish people, the nightmare had only begun. Families were torn apart as thousands were executed or sent to labor camps. The Jewish population faced immediate persecution, marked, isolated, and slowly pushed toward annihilation. Streets once filled with life were now lined with fear. Children whispered prayers while sirens wailed in the distance. In this darkness, heroes began to emerge. Ordinary men and women formed secret resistance groups smuggling food, intelligence, and hope. Underground newspapers told the truth when official voices spread lies. They fought not just for Poland, but for the soul of humanity. The fall of Poland sent a message to the world that Hitler's vision was unstoppable unless the world united. But unity was far away, and fear ruled the hearts of nations. The war had just begun, and already millions were suffering. As smoke rose from the ruins of Warsaw, one thing became clear: this was not just a political war, it was a war of survival, conscience, and of humanity itself. As Europe watched Poland fall, the world began to understand the terrifying force that Adolf Hitler had built, a war machine designed for domination. Germany was no longer the broken nation of 1918. In less than 6 years, it had transformed into the most advanced military power on Earth. Every soldier, every tank, every aircraft moved with precision, the result of a system built on fear, loyalty, and propaganda. The Nazi regime had turned Germany into a nation of warriors. From the classrooms to the factories, every citizen was taught that service to the Führer was the highest honor. Children joined the Hitler Youth, learning to march, to salute, and to believe. The people didn't just fight for their country, they fought for an idea, one that twisted truth into myth and turned obedience into faith. Behind the front lines, the German industry roared like a giant engine. Factories worked day and night, producing tanks, planes, and weapons at a speed never seen before. Engineers perfected the Panzer tanks fast, powerful, and deadly. The Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, ruled the skies with bombers and fighters that could strike anywhere, anytime. But this wasn't just military strength. It was psychological warfare. Nazi propaganda painted Hitler as a savior, a man chosen by destiny to restore Germany's greatness. Joseph Goebbels, the master of lies, controlled the media, the newspapers, the radio. Every message, every film, every poster told the same story. Germany was invincible, and its enemies were weak. Across Europe, fear began to spread. Nations trembled as Hitler's armies grew stronger. His next targets were already in his sights: Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The Blitzkrieg was ready to strike again. Meanwhile, inside Germany, not everyone believed in the Nazi dream. There were whispers of resistance, soldiers, priests, and citizens who dared to question the madness. But those who spoke were silenced. The Gestapo listened everywhere. In this world of terror, silence became survival. By 1940, the Nazi war machine stood ready to conquer. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and an air force unmatched in power, all waiting for the command that would plunge Europe deeper into chaos. The storm was coming, and this time no one would escape it. For Hitler, war was not just about land or power, it was about reshaping humanity itself. The Nazi dream was becoming a global nightmare. May 1940, Europe trembled once again. After months of uneasy silence, Hitler's army struck like lightning. This time, their target was France, one of the world's proudest and most powerful nations. The attack came with terrifying speed. German tanks sliced through Belgium and the Netherlands, outflanking Allied forces who still fought with the slow tactics of the last war. It was blitzkrieg at its peak, fast, coordinated, and merciless. While British and French troops rushed to defend the Maginot Line, the Germans did the unthinkable. They invaded through the Ardennes forest, a region everyone believed was impassable for tanks. Within days, the German forces had broken through. The Allied defense collapsed like a house of cards. Civilians fled in panic as the sky filled with the roar of Luftwaffe bombers. Entire towns vanished under firestorms. Roads were jammed with refugees, mothers clutching children, soldiers retreating, horses, carts, cars all moving in chaos. France, once the symbol of strength and beauty, was being torn apart before the world's eyes. By late May, hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were trapped at Dunkirk, surrounded by German forces on all sides. What followed was one of the most desperate rescues in history. Civilian boats, fishing vessels, and naval ships raced across the English Channel in a miracle evacuation that saved over 300,000 men. Dunkirk became a symbol of courage, but it couldn't stop the inevitable. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. The City of Light fell into darkness. Nazi flags waved over the Eiffel Tower, and German boots echoed through the empty streets. The French government surrendered soon after, and the world gasped. France, the mighty, had fallen in just 6 weeks. For Hitler, it was his greatest triumph. Europe now bowed before him. Only Britain remained free, standing alone against a tide of tyranny. But victory brought with it arrogance. Hitler believed nothing could stop him. His armies were unbeatable, his people unstoppable. The war machine seemed invincible. But in the shadows of occupied France, seeds of resistance began to grow. Men and women, young and old, swore to fight back with words, sabotage, and sacrifice. They would risk everything to reclaim their country, even when hope seemed lost. As German soldiers celebrated in Paris, the world realized that the battle for humanity had only just begun. The flames of war were spreading from Europe to the skies above Britain, and soon, across the entire world. Summer 1940. The skies above Britain turned into the world's deadliest battlefield. France had fallen. Europe lay under Hitler's control, and now, only one nation stood between Nazi domination and total victory: Great Britain. The stage was set for one of the most legendary conflicts in history, the Battle of Britain. Hitler believed it would be quick. His Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was the largest and most powerful on Earth. Britain's Royal Air Force, or RAF, was smaller, outnumbered, and exhausted. Yet, what Hitler didn't understand was the spirit of the British people, their courage, their resilience, and their unbreakable will to survive. In July 1940, the German assault began. Waves of bombers and fighters crossed the English Channel, targeting airfields, radar stations, and cities. The skies thundered with the roar of engines, and trails of smoke marked the path of death. The young pilots of the RAF, many barely out of their teens, rose to meet the enemy in deadly dogfights miles above the earth. They fought with everything they had, outnumbered, but not outmatched. They used speed, strategy, and pure bravery to defend their homeland. Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister, called them the few, and rightly so. These men carried the fate of the free world on their shoulders. As the battle raged on, Hitler grew impatient. When his air attacks failed to break the RAF, he changed his strategy. The Luftwaffe began bombing cities London, Coventry, Birmingham in a campaign known as the Blitz. Night after night, sirens wailed as bombs rained down on innocent civilians. Families hid in shelters, praying for morning light. Fires burned through the night sky, painting Britain's cities in shades of red and black. But Britain did not surrender. Even as homes burned and lives were lost, the people refused to bow. Keep calm and carry on became more than a slogan, it became a way of life. From the ashes, courage was born. By October 1940, Hitler realized his air campaign had failed. The RAF still controlled the skies. Britain still stood proud. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped. The Battle of Britain proved that courage and unity could stand against tyranny. It was not just a victory of weapons, but of will, a message to the world that humanity still had hope. As the sun set over London in the autumn of 1940, the sky turned into a battlefield. Night after night, the sound of sirens shattered the silence. Families rushed to underground shelters, clutching what little they could carry: blankets, photos, the hope to see another dawn. Above them, German bombers filled the skies, their engines echoing like thunder across the sleeping city. This was the Blitz. For 8 long months, the Luftwaffe unleashed relentless air raids on Britain's cities London, Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, and beyond. Whole neighborhoods were reduced to ashes. Thousands were killed, millions left homeless. Yet, amidst the horror, something remarkable happened. The spirit of resistance was born. In the face of destruction, the British people refused to break. Children slept in subway tunnels while their parents volunteered as fire wardens, rescue workers, and nurses. Men and women stood side by side, digging through rubble to pull out survivors. Each act of bravery became a small victory against fear. Winston Churchill's voice echoed through the radio. "We shall never surrender." Those words became the heartbeat of a nation. London's streets glowed with fire, but its people stood unshaken. Even as bombs fell, milkmen continued their rounds. Trains kept running, and soldiers marched on. The famous dome of St. Paul's Cathedral stood tall amid the smoke, a symbol that Britain's soul could not be destroyed. Meanwhile, deep within the countryside, a new kind of resistance was forming. In secret workshops and hidden fields, radar scientists, engineers, and spies worked tirelessly. They intercepted enemy communications, designed new weapons, and created systems that would later turn the tide of the war. This unseen army fought not with guns, but with intellect and innovation. And then there were the ordinary heroes, the women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force who directed pilots in combat, the firefighters who battled flames as buildings collapsed around them, the nurses who worked through the night, refusing to rest. Each of them fought the battle for humanity in their own way, not with hatred, but with heart. By May 1941, the Blitz began to slow. Hitler turned his eyes east, toward the Soviet Union. The bombing eased, but the scars remained. Entire families were gone, cities lay in ruins, yet Britain still stood. The world watched and realized something powerful. That courage was not born on the battlefield. It was born in the hearts of people who refused to give up. The Blitz did not destroy Britain. It forged it into steel. June 22, 1941, the dawn of betrayal. As the sun rose over Eastern Europe, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. For months, he had promised peace to the Soviet Union, even signing a pact of friendship. But behind the smiles and handshakes lay deception. Now, the Nazi war machine turned eastward, aiming to destroy communism and seize the vast lands of Russia. At 3:15 a.m., the silence of the border was shattered. Thousands of artillery guns opened fire. Planes screamed through the morning sky, bombing railways, airfields, and cities. Within hours, chaos consumed the Soviet frontier. Villages burned. Soldiers were cut off before they could even receive orders. It was another blitzkrieg, fast, ruthless, unstoppable. The Red Army was caught off guard. Many Soviet troops had no ammunition, no communication, no plan. Entire divisions were surrounded within days. By the end of the first week, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. Hitler believed victory was inevitable. He thought the Soviet Union would collapse in a matter of months, a fatal mistake that would later cost him everything. As the German army advanced deeper, the brutality of war reached new heights. Entire towns were wiped out. Civilians were executed without mercy. The Nazis saw the Slavic people as inferior, treating them not as humans but as obstacles. Behind the front lines, Einsatzgruppen mobile killing squads began their dark work, executing Jews, communists, and anyone who resisted. The war in the East was not just about conquest. It was a war of annihilation. But the Soviet people refused to die quietly. Even as cities burned, resistance fighters rose from the ashes. Villagers sabotaged supply lines, farmers hid weapons, and soldiers fought to the last bullet. The Red Army began to regroup, slow, wounded, but unbroken. By autumn, the German advance reached the gates of Moscow. Snow began to fall. The roads turned to mud. The engines froze. And the soldiers dressed for summer began to die not from bullets, but from the cold. Hitler had underestimated not just the Soviet army, but Russia itself, its size, its people, and its unforgiving winter. The invasion that was meant to end in triumph became a nightmare. Millions were dead, and the Eastern Front had become a graveyard for dreams of conquest. Operation Barbarossa marked a turning point. The moment when Hitler's ambition began to consume his empire from within. The war for humanity had reached its bloodiest stage. September 8, 1941, the city of Leningrad was surrounded. German and Finnish forces had closed in from every direction, cutting off all roads, railways, and supply lines. What began that day would become one of the longest and most horrific sieges in human history. The Siege of Leningrad. For 900 days, the people of Leningrad would endure starvation, bombings, and unimaginable suffering. Hitler's orders were clear: wipe the city from the face of the earth. He had no intention of capturing it, only destroying it. The Nazis believed the Soviet spirit would break, but they were wrong. At first, the people thought the siege would last a few weeks. But as the winter of 1941 set in, reality struck hard. Food supplies ran out, electricity failed, The water froze in the pipes. People began boiling wallpaper for the glue, grinding leather belts to make soup, and eating whatever they could find. Cats, dogs, even sawdust mixed with bread. Hunger became the city's deadliest enemy. Bombs rained from the sky day and night. Hospitals were destroyed. Schools reduced to rubble. Families lived in basements, listening to the distant rumble of artillery and the cries of the wounded. In the middle of this nightmare, people still tried to live. Teachers taught classes in ruins. Musicians played concerts to keep hope alive. And children wrote in diaries that would one day tell the world what true courage meant. One such child was Tanya Savicheva, a young girl who kept a diary during the siege. Her simple words broke hearts across the world. Zhenya died on December 28th. Grandma died on January 25th. The Savichevs are dead. Only Tanya is left. By early 1942, over 500,000 people had perished not from bombs, but from hunger and cold. Yet the city refused to surrender. Soviet forces outside Leningrad fought fiercely to break the encirclement. Engineers risked their lives to build a lifeline across the frozen Lake Ladoga, a narrow, dangerous route called the Road of Life. Through blizzards and enemy fire, trucks carried food into the city and brought out the weak and wounded. It was never enough, but it kept Leningrad alive. For 2.5 years, the people of Leningrad stood unbroken. When the siege finally ended in January 1944, over 1 million civilians were dead, but the city had not fallen. The siege of Leningrad was not just a military story, it was a story of human endurance, of courage in the face of despair, and of a people who refused to surrender their humanity even when surrounded by death. By the summer of 1942, the German war machine pushed deeper into Soviet territory. Hitler's next target was a city that carried both strategic and symbolic power: Stalingrad, a city named after Joseph Stalin himself. To Hitler, capturing it would mean breaking Soviet morale. To Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. And so began one of the bloodiest battles in human history: the Battle of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, advanced with overwhelming confidence. They had crushed every obstacle in their path. By August, Stalingrad was burning. Luftwaffe bombers turned the city into a wasteland of smoke and rubble. Civilians were trapped with nowhere to run. But amidst the destruction, the Soviet defenders refused to give up. Every building became a fortress. Every street, a battlefield. Soldiers fought room to room, floor to floor, sometimes separated by only a wall from their enemies. The Volga River behind them was their only supply route, and crossing it meant certain death under German fire. Still, reinforcements came, one small boat at a time. The battle was brutal beyond imagination. Snipers hunted through the ruins, factories became strongholds, and soldiers fought with knives, bricks, even their bare hands. The city's famous tractor factory continued producing tanks, sometimes sending them straight into battle as soon as they rolled off the assembly line. Stalin's order was simple: not one step back, and his men obeyed. As autumn turned to winter, the tide began to change. The Germans, stretched thin and freezing, faced a growing Soviet counteroffensive. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. Soviet forces surrounded Stalingrad from the north and south, trapping 300,000 German soldiers inside the city. Hitler ordered Paulus to fight to the last man, but supplies ran out, ammunition dwindled, and starvation set in. The once mighty German army was now trapped, hungry, desperate, and freezing to death in the ruins of the city they came to conquer. By February 1943, the inevitable happened. General Paulus surrendered, defying Hitler's direct command. Over 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, and only a few thousand would ever return home. The fall of Stalingrad marked the turning point of World War II. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been shattered. The myth of German invincibility was destroyed, and the Red Army began its long, bloody march westward toward Berlin. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than a victory, it was a rebirth of hope. It showed the world that even in the darkest times, courage and sacrifice could still shape the course of humanity. While the snow fell over Stalingrad, Another war raged beneath the blazing sun in the deserts of North Africa. Here, the landscape was endless sand, scorching heat, and brutal windstorms. Yet this barren land became one of the most important battlefields of World War II. Whoever controlled North Africa controlled the Mediterranean, and the key to invading Europe. In 1940, Italy had joined the war on Hitler's side, dreaming of an empire across Africa. But their dreams quickly turned to disaster. British forces, though outnumbered, struck back with speed and precision, capturing thousands of Italian soldiers in weeks. To save his ally, Hitler sent one of his most brilliant commanders, General Erwin Rommel, known to the world as the Desert Fox. Rommel was a master of strategy and deception. His tanks moved swiftly across the dunes, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. He used speed, surprise, and cunning to defeat stronger forces, earning respect even from his enemies. For months, his Afrika Korps pushed the British back toward Egypt, capturing supply bases and dominating the desert sands. But the British were not finished. A new commander, General Bernard Montgomery, took charge of the 8th Army. Under his leadership, the tide began to turn. With fresh troops and improved tactics, Montgomery prepared for a decisive stand, the Battle of El Alamein. In October 1942, the desert erupted in fire. Tanks clashed in massive formations, artillery thundered across the horizon, and the night sky burned red. For 12 brutal days, both sides fought without rest. But this time, the Allies had the advantage: superior numbers, supplies, and air power. When the smoke cleared, Rommel's forces were in retreat. El Alamein was the first major Allied victory against the Axis on land. It broke the myth of Nazi invincibility and lifted the morale of the entire world. Winston Churchill declared proudly, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." By May 1943, the Allies had pushed the Axis out of Africa entirely. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered in Tunisia, a blow as devastating as Stalingrad. For the first time, the Allies stood on the edge of Europe, ready to strike at Hitler's southern flank. The Desert War was not fought for sand, it was fought for the future. It proved that courage, unity, and strategy could overcome even the strongest enemy, and it set the stage for the next great invasion, Italy. After victory in North Africa, the Allies turned their eyes to Europe's soft underbelly, Italy. It was the next step in freeing Europe from Nazi control and striking directly at the heart of fascism. Italy had once been proud under Benito Mussolini, Hitler's closest ally, but by 1943, the dream of empire had turned to ashes. The Italian people were exhausted, their cities bombed, their armies broken, and their faith in Mussolini fading fast. In July 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. British and American troops landed under the cover of darkness, facing fierce resistance from German and Italian defenders. The beaches exploded with fire and chaos, but the Allies pressed forward, using air power and naval bombardment to secure the island. Within weeks, Sicily was theirs, and Mussolini's rule began to crumble. Back in Rome, his government lost faith in him. Even his generals turned away. On July 25, 1943, Mussolini was arrested and removed from power by his own council. The man who once dreamed of ruling a new Roman Empire was now a prisoner. The Italian people cheered, believing the war might soon end. But Hitler refused to let Italy go. German troops poured into the country, taking control of key cities and rescuing Mussolini in a daring commando raid. They placed him as the puppet leader of a new Italian social republic in the north. But his power was gone. Italy was now a battlefield divided between Germans in the north and Allies advancing from the south. In September 1943, the Allies landed on the Italian mainland at Salerno and Taranto. The fighting was brutal. The mountains, rivers, and narrow roads gave every advantage to the German defenders. The Allies pushed forward inch by inch, facing ambushes, mines, and endless rain. The city of Naples rose in rebellion, forcing German troops to retreat. One of the first major civilian uprisings in occupied Europe, By the end of 1943, southern Italy was free, but the road to Rome remained deadly. The Germans, led by the skilled Field Marshal Kesselring, turned every hill and village into a fortress. Winter came, and the fighting slowed. Soldiers dug into muddy trenches, while civilians suffered between two advancing armies. The invasion of Italy was slow and painful, but it struck a deep blow to fascism. Mussolini's empire had fallen, and Hitler had lost another ally. Italy's people had begun their own battle not just to survive, but to reclaim their nation from tyranny. For the first time, the Axis was on the defensive. The tide of war was beginning to turn. After victory in North Africa, the Allies turned their eyes to Europe's soft underbelly, Italy. It was the next step in freeing Europe from Nazi control and striking directly at the heart of fascism. Italy had once been proud under Benito Mussolini, Hitler's closest ally, but by 1943, the dream of empire had turned to ashes. The Italian people were exhausted, their cities bombed, their armies broken, and their faith in Mussolini fading fast. In July 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. British and American troops landed under the cover of darkness, facing fierce resistance from German and Italian defenders. The beaches exploded with fire and chaos, but the Allies pressed forward, using air power and naval bombardment to secure the island. Within weeks, Sicily was theirs, and Mussolini's rule began to crumble. Back in Rome, his government lost faith in him. Even his generals turned away. On July 25, 1943, Mussolini was arrested and removed from power by his own council. The man who once dreamed of ruling a new Roman Empire was now a prisoner. The Italian people cheered, believing the war might soon end. But Hitler refused to let Italy go. German troops poured into the country, taking control of key cities and rescuing Mussolini in a daring commando raid. They placed him as the puppet leader of a new Italian social republic in the north. But his power was gone. Italy was now a battlefield divided between Germans in the north and Allies advancing from the south. In September 1943, the Allies landed on the Italian mainland at Salerno and Taranto. The fighting was brutal. The mountains, rivers, and narrow roads gave every advantage to the German defenders. The Allies pushed forward inch by inch, facing ambushes, mines, and endless rain. The city of Naples rose in rebellion, forcing German troops to retreat. One of the first major civilian uprisings in occupied Europe. By the end of 1943, southern Italy was free, but the road to Rome remained deadly. The Germans, led by the skilled Field Marshal Kesselring, turned every hill and village into a fortress. Winter came, and the fighting slowed. Soldiers dug into muddy trenches, while civilians suffered between two advancing armies. The invasion of Italy was slow and painful, but it struck a deep blow to fascism. Mussolini's empire had fallen, and Hitler had lost another ally. Italy's people had begun their own battle not just to survive, but to reclaim their nation from tyranny. For the first time, the Axis was on the defensive. The tide of war was beginning to turn. June 6, 1944, a date forever written in history. It was the day when freedom began its march across Europe once again. The world would remember it as D-Day, the greatest amphibious invasion ever attempted, and the turning point of World War II. For years, the Allies had prepared in secret, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, an army of over 150,000 soldiers, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft gathered in England. They trained, waited, and prayed for the moment to strike. The target: Normandy, France, a heavily fortified coastline under German occupation. The success of the entire war depended on this single day. As midnight struck, paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped behind enemy lines. They landed in darkness, scattered across fields and villages, fighting alone and confused but determined. Their mission: to cut off German reinforcements and clear the way for the main invasion. At dawn, the horizon lit up with fire. Allied warships opened a massive bombardment on the coast, shaking the earth. Then, the landing craft advanced, thousands of soldiers heading straight into the storm of bullets. The beaches were given code names: Utah, Omaha, gold, Juno, and sword. At Omaha Beach, the cost was almost unbearable. German machine guns cut through the first waves of American troops. Bodies fell into the cold surf, and the sea turned red. But the soldiers refused to give up. They crawled, fought, and climbed through fire, breaking through the German defenses inch by inch. By the end of the day, despite horrific losses, the Allies had secured all 5 beaches. Behind them came tanks, artillery, engineers, and supplies, the full force of liberation. Villagers watched in tears as the Allied flags rose once more over French soil. The impossible had been achieved. Europe's liberation had begun, but D-Day was only the beginning. The Allies still had to push through hedgerows, towns, and rivers, every step contested by German troops determined to hold on. The fighting was fierce, the losses heavy, but morale was unbreakable. The world now believed Hitler could be defeated. Eisenhower's message to his troops that morning had said it all. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. And they did. From the beaches of Normandy, the road to Berlin had begun. After the thunder of D-Day, the battle for France began. The beaches of Normandy were secured, but the countryside ahead was a deadly maze of hedgerows, villages, and German defenses. Every field was a trap, every road a battlefield. For the soldiers of the Allied armies, every inch of France had to be won with blood and courage. Through June and July 1944, the fighting was relentless. American, British, and Canadian troops faced elite German divisions, including the fearsome panzer units. The air was filled with smoke, dust, and the roar of tanks. The Allies slowly broke through the German lines, using superior air power and overwhelming coordination. Then came Operation Cobra, the breakout. In late July, Allied bombers unleashed a massive aerial assault, blasting open a path through German defenses. Tanks poured through the gap, racing across open fields in a storm of dust and fire. The German army began to crumble under the pressure, retreating toward the River Seine. As the Allies advanced, the spirit of resistance rose across France. For 4 long years, the French people had lived under Nazi occupation, their freedom stolen, their pride crushed. But now, whispers of liberation filled the air. Saboteurs destroyed rail lines, partisans attacked convoys, and underground fighters prepared for the moment they had dreamed of. In August 1944, the order came: Paris must be liberated. The French resistance launched a full-scale uprising, seizing police stations and government buildings. Barricades rose in the streets. Gunfire echoed through the boulevards. The people of Paris fought for their city, for their dignity, for their freedom. The Allied command had not planned to enter Paris immediately, but one man could not wait: General Charles de Gaulle. He insisted that French troops must lead the liberation of their capital. And so, on August 24th, elements of the 2nd French Armored Division entered the city. By the next day, the tricolor flag once again waved proudly from the Eiffel Tower. Crowds flooded the streets, tears of joy mixing with the smoke of battle. Women embraced soldiers, church bells rang across the city, and the world rejoiced. After 4 years of darkness, Paris was free. When General de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, he said only one thing: Paris. Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated. The liberation of France was more than a victory of arms, it was a victory of the human spirit. From the ashes of occupation, the heart of Europe had begun to beat again. By late 1944, it seemed that the end of Nazi Germany was near. France was liberated, the Allies were advancing toward Germany's border, and the Soviet armies were closing in from the east. But Adolf Hitler was not ready to surrender. He planned one last, desperate strike, a counterattack, meant to split the Allied armies and turn the tide of war back in his favor. It was December 16, 1944. In the dense, snow-covered forests of Ardennes, the silence of winter was shattered by thunder. Thousands of German tanks and soldiers stormed through the Allied lines in a massive surprise attack. It was Hitler's last gamble, and it would become one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The German offensive created a huge bulge in the Allied front line, and so the battle took its name, the Battle of the Bulge. The weather was terrible: freezing cold, blizzards, and fog grounding Allied aircraft and trapping soldiers in the snow. American troops, caught off guard, were forced to fight with dwindling ammunition and supplies. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of defiance and endurance. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division held firm against overwhelming odds. They were surrounded, bombarded, and cut off from reinforcements. When the Germans demanded their surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe sent a one-word reply that became legend: nuts. It was a message of defiance that inspired every soldier on the front. Then, as if nature itself sided with freedom, the skies cleared. Allied planes roared back into action, striking German convoys and supply lines. General George S. Patton, famous for his speed and boldness, turned his entire army north in record time to relieve Bastogne. Through snow, ice, and chaos, his tanks smashed through German positions, bringing hope to the surrounded troops. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. Their tanks ran out of fuel, their soldiers out of time. Over 100,000 German casualties marked the cost of Hitler's final gamble. The once mighty Wehrmacht was shattered beyond repair. For the Allies, it was a hard-won victory, proof that unity and courage could withstand even the darkest storm. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end. The road to Berlin now lay open. As the smoke cleared over the frozen forests, one truth was clear: the tide of war had turned forever. Hitler's empire was dying, and the world was preparing for its final battle. By early 1945, the world stood at the edge of history. The Allied forces were closing in on Germany from the west, and the Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east. Adolf Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich was crumbling into dust. Cities lay in ruins, the German army was shattered, and millions of civilians fled before the advancing front. The final act of the war in Europe was about to begin: the Battle of Berlin. In April 1945, the Soviet offensive thundered toward the German capital. Thousands of artillery guns fired day and night, turning the city into a sea of fire. The once mighty capital of the Nazi Empire had become a fortress of rubble, defended by what remained of Hitler's army: old men, young boys, and fanatical SS troops who refused to surrender. Inside his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler refused to face reality. He moved imaginary divisions on maps, issued impossible orders, and ranted against betrayal. He still dreamed of victory while his empire burned above him. The sounds of bombs and artillery grew closer each hour, a grim reminder that the end was inevitable. Outside, Berlin was chaos. Soviet tanks rumbled through shattered streets, fighting block by block. German civilians hid in basements, praying for survival as shells tore through their homes. Every building became a fortress, every corner a grave. The Red Army showed no mercy. After years of German brutality in the East, vengeance had come home. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on the Reichstag, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his bunker. The man who had plunged the world into chaos died surrounded by lies and ruin. His body was burned in the courtyard above, while Berlin continued to burn around him. 2 days later, the city surrendered. The swastika was torn down, and the red Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag, a symbol that the war in Europe was finally ending. On May 8, 1945, the guns of war fell silent. It was Victory in Europe Day. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, Moscow, and New York, cheering, crying, and dancing. After 6 long years, the nightmare was over, but the joy was mixed with sorrow. Tens of millions were dead, cities destroyed, families torn apart. The world had been forever changed. The fall of Berlin marked not just the end of Hitler's empire, it marked the rebirth of humanity from the ashes of war. Freedom had triumphed, but the cost was beyond measure. When the guns of war began to fall silent, the world thought it had seen the worst. But as the Allied armies moved deeper into Nazi territory, they uncovered horrors beyond imagination: the true face of Hitler's regime. Behind the front lines, hidden from the eyes of the world, stood the concentration camps, places where humanity itself had been destroyed. As soldiers entered Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and countless others, they were met not by enemies, but by the ghosts of the innocent. The scenes defied belief. Mountains of bodies, starvation, disease, and the empty eyes of survivors who had endured the unendurable. What they found was not just evidence of war crimes, it was proof of genocide. Between 1941 and 1945, under Hitler's orders, the Nazi regime carried out the systematic extermination of millions of people, 6 million Jews, and millions more whom the Nazis deemed undesirable. Roma, Poles, Slavs, prisoners of war, the disabled, and political dissidents. It was the Holocaust, humanity's darkest chapter. In the ghettos of Warsaw, Krakow, and Lodz, families were torn apart. In the death camps, trains arrived daily, packed with men, women, and children who believed they were being resettled. Instead, they were sent to gas chambers disguised as showers. Their belongings were taken, their identities erased. All that remained were ashes and silence. When Allied soldiers opened the camp gates, silence turned to shock. Battle-hardened men wept at what they saw. They fed the starving, buried the dead, and recorded everything: photographs, film, and testimony to ensure the world would never forget. The survivors, frail but unbroken, stood as living proof of both human cruelty and human endurance. At Nuremberg, after the war, the Nazi leaders were tried for crimes against humanity. The evidence was undeniable, the guilt inescapable, but no trial, no punishment, could ever undo what was done. The Holocaust forced the world to ask a question that still echoes today. How could civilization fall so far? How could a nation of culture, science, and progress commit such evil? From the ashes of Auschwitz came a vow, a promise made by survivors and soldiers alike. Never again. It became more than a phrase. It became a duty to remember, to teach, and to guard against the return of hate. Because the battle for humanity did not end in 1945. It began there, in the memory of those who perished, and in the conscience of those who survived. While Europe celebrated victory, the war in the Pacific still raged on. Japan, though surrounded and beaten back on all fronts, refused to surrender. Every island taken by the Allies had cost thousands of lives. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, the fighting had been merciless, soldiers and civilians alike dying rather than yielding. The world had never seen such ferocity. And as the Allies prepared to invade Japan itself, one thing was clear: the cost would be unimaginable. To avoid that bloodshed, the United States made a decision that would forever change the course of human history. In the early dawn of August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it dropped a weapon unlike any the world had ever known: the atomic bomb. In a flash of blinding light, the city vanished. A fireball hotter than the sun erupted, leveling buildings and incinerating everything within miles. Tens of thousands were killed instantly. Countless others suffered burns and radiation that would haunt them for years. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Another city disappeared in fire and ash. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 200,000 lives had been lost. In that moment, the world entered a new era: the atomic age. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Entire families turned to shadows on walls. Hospitals overflowed with the dying. The survivors, the Hibakusha, carried scars, both visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. The bombs forced Japan to face the inevitable. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation for the first time, his voice trembling as he announced surrender. For Japan, the war was over. For the world, a terrifying new power had been born, one that could destroy civilization itself. In the streets of New York, London, and Moscow, people celebrated. Church bells rang, flags waved, tears of joy flowed freely. It was Victory Over Japan Day, VJ Day. The Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, had finally ended. But even in triumph, there was unease. Humanity had defeated tyranny, only to unleash a weapon capable of annihilation on a global scale. The atomic bomb was both victory and warning. It ended one war, but began another, the silent, cold struggle for survival that would define the modern age. In Hiroshima's ruins, a single message was found scratched into stone. Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the evil. It was a prayer and a reminder that the true battle for humanity was far from over. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world awoke to a new reality. Cities lay in ruins, nations were broken, and more than 60 million lives had been lost. Every continent had been scarred, every family touched by tragedy. The war was over, but peace would not come easily. Across Europe and Asia, survivors wandered through the ashes of their homes, searching for loved ones who would never return. Entire towns were gone, wiped off the map. Children grew up amidst rubble, clutching photographs of parents lost to bombs, bullets, or concentration camps. The human cost of war could not be measured in numbers, only in grief. But from that grief came determination. The same hands that once held rifles now began rebuilding homes, schools, and hope. In the heart of destruction, people found courage to start again. In London, Warsaw, and Tokyo, bricks were laid, bridges repaired, lives restarted. Every sunrise became a symbol of survival. The victors faced new challenges. Germany was divided, Japan occupied, and Europe starved for food and fuel. To prevent another descent into chaos, the Allies took a bold step to rebuild, not to punish. The Marshall Plan, launched by the United States, poured billions of dollars into Europe, helping nations rise from ruin. Factories reopened, streets lit up again, and a shattered continent began to breathe once more. At the same time, a new hope for peace emerged: the United Nations. Formed in 1945, it united countries under one purpose: to prevent the horrors of war from ever returning. For the first time in history, humanity created a platform where nations could talk before they fought. It was imperfect, but it was a beginning. Yet peace came with new tensions. The alliance that had defeated Hitler soon fractured into mistrust. The world split into two camps, the West and the Soviet Union, and a new kind of war began, fought not with bullets, but with ideology and fear. The Cold War had begun, casting a shadow over this fragile peace. Still, for millions of ordinary people, the post-war years were about survival and hope. Families reunited, soldiers returned home, and children were born into a world trying to forget its pain. Songs returned to the radio, laughter to the streets. Humanity, scarred but alive, was learning to dream again. The world after World War II was not perfect, but it was wiser. It had seen the depths of darkness, and now it sought the light. The message was clear: war had destroyed humanity once. It was up to humanity to rebuild itself. As the ashes of World War II settled, the world faced a profound question. What kind of future would humanity build from the ruins of its own destruction? The war had redrawn maps, reshaped empires, and rewritten history itself. Old powers had fallen, and new ones had risen. The United States and the Soviet Union now stood as global superpowers, their uneasy alliance turning swiftly into rivalry. While the guns were silent, a new kind of battle had begun, one fought through politics, propaganda, and fear. It was the dawn of the Cold War. But amid this tension, something extraordinary was also happening: a world struggling to find balance, order, and peace. In 1945, the nations of the earth gathered in San Francisco to form the United Nations, a beacon of hope born from the blood of millions. Its charter promised that future generations would be spared from the scourge of war. It was humanity's collective vow: never again. From the ruins of Europe rose the dream of unity. Old enemies began to rebuild side by side. Germany, once the heart of destruction, was divided east and west, but even there, new beginnings took root. In 1951, the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community laid the foundation for what would one day become the European Union, proof that cooperation could succeed where conquest had failed. Across Asia, nations emerged from colonial rule, inspired by the struggle for freedom and self-determination. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others began shaping their own destinies. The world was changing rapidly, irreversibly. Technology, born from the fires of war, now promised a better tomorrow. Jet engines, radar, and nuclear power were no longer weapons alone. They became tools of progress. The same human spirit that had created destruction was now turning toward discovery. But even as the world rebuilt, the scars of war remained. The memory of Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and Stalingrad became eternal warnings, reminders of how far humanity could fall when hatred and power go unchecked. The war had shown both the worst and the best of mankind. From the courage of soldiers on the beaches of Normandy, to the resistance fighters in the shadows, to the survivors who rebuilt their shattered lives, each had proven that even in the darkest night, the flame of humanity never truly dies. World War II changed everything. Borders, nations, ideologies, all were transformed. But perhaps its greatest legacy was not in what it destroyed, but in what it taught. That freedom is fragile, peace is precious, and the cost of forgetting is too high. The battle for humanity did not end in 1945. It continues in every act of justice, every stand for truth, and every choice to build instead of destroy. The war had ended, but for millions of soldiers, the real battle was only beginning. The battle to return home. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Burma, they had survived hell. Now, they were heading back to a world that had moved on without them. The journey home was filled with mixed emotions, joy, relief, and deep sorrow. Trains and ships carried them across oceans and continents. Men who had seen too much, lost too much. Some returned to cheering crowds and tearful families. Others stepped off silently, their eyes carrying the memories of battlefields that would never fade. For many, the home they longed for no longer existed. Cities were in ruins, families scattered, loved ones gone. The laughter of reunion was often followed by the silence of grief. Victory had come, but at a price few could bear. In America, soldiers known as the greatest generation were celebrated as heroes. They came back to a nation ready to rebuild and dream again. But even there, behind the parades and medals, nightmares lingered. Men woke screaming in the night, haunted by the echo of gunfire and the faces of fallen friends. Back then, there was no name for it. Today, we call it PTSD. In Europe, returning soldiers faced hunger and devastation. The war had destroyed not only cities, but also the spirit of millions. German soldiers came home to find their nation divided and defeated. In Russia, the Red Army's victors returned to a homeland still mourning 20 million dead. Every soldier, no matter the uniform, carried the same invisible scars. Women too, who had worked in factories, farms, and hospitals, faced their own struggles. They had kept nations running while men fought abroad. But as peace returned, many were pushed back into silence, their wartime strength forgotten by history. Yet, they were the unsung backbone of victory, the quiet heroes of humanity's darkest chapter. Some soldiers found solace in rebuilding homes, starting families, creating life where death had ruled. Others couldn't adjust. The war had changed them too deeply. They carried guilt for surviving when their brothers did not, for killing in a war they could barely understand. And yet, amid the pain, there was hope. Children born after the war grew up under the banner of peace. For them, the horror of 1939 to 1945 was a story told in whispers, not lived in fear. The soldiers who had returned carried one message for them: never forget what it cost to be free. The return of the soldiers was not just the end of war, it was the beginning of remembrance, because every face that came home carried the story of one who never would. When the last gun fell silent, and the flags of victory were raised, the world celebrated the end of war. But beneath the cheers and parades, there lingered a quieter truth. The war had not ended inside those who survived it. Millions carried wounds that no doctor could see. Behind the medals and uniforms were eyes haunted by memories too painful to speak of. The world saw heroes, but many soldiers saw ghosts. In the years that followed, veterans of World War II struggled to find their place in a world that could never understand what they had endured. They tried to return to normal lives, to smile again, to sleep again. But the war followed them in their dreams, in the sound of thunder, in the silence of the night. They had survived the battlefield, but the battle within had only begun. No one had the words then. No one spoke of trauma or mental scars. A man who trembled at loud noises was told to be strong. A soldier who cried for his fallen comrades was told to forget. But forgetting was impossible. Every face, every scream, every moment of terror was burned into their souls. In hospitals across the world, thousands of wounded soldiers faced years of recovery, limbs lost, bodies shattered, but spirits refusing to surrender. Prosthetic limbs replaced what war had taken, but nothing could replace what it had broken inside. Still, they endured not for glory, but for life itself. Civilians bore their own invisible wounds. Mothers who had lost sons, children who had seen too much, refugees who wandered the earth with nothing but memories. For them, survival was not victory, it was a burden. The war had ended, but its shadow reached into every home, every heart. Art, literature, and film began to reveal what words could not. Books like Night and The Diary of Anne Frank gave voice to the voiceless, reminders that even in the darkest suffering, humanity's spirit could still rise. Through their stories, the world began to understand the true cost of war, not just in numbers, but in souls. In time, psychologists gave a name to the pain that haunted these men and women. Post-traumatic stress disorder. It was not weakness. It was the price of courage. It was the echo of every bullet, every scream, every loss. The hidden wounds of World War II never truly healed. They lived on in memories, in families, in generations shaped by silence and resilience. The survivors had fought for the world's freedom, and now they fought for their own peace. And in their quiet struggle, humanity learned one final lesson. War does not end when the fighting stops. It ends when the healing begins. Out of the ruins of World War II, a new world began to rise. Fragile, wounded, but determined to live again. The destruction had been total, but so too was humanity's will to rebuild. This was not just a time of recovery, it was a rebirth. The dawn of modern humanity. Across continents, cities, once reduced to ashes, began to glow again. Factories reopened, railways hummed, and streets filled with the sound of life returning. Children played in bombed-out courtyards where tanks once rolled. Where there had been despair, now there was defiance, a promise that the world would not die in darkness. Technology, born from war, became the foundation of progress. The same scientists who had created weapons now turned to peace. Jet engines powered civilian planes, connecting nations like never before. Medicines developed on the front lines saved millions of lives. The atomic age had arrived, terrifying, yet full of potential. The world stood on the edge of both destruction and discovery. In politics, a new order emerged. The United States and the Soviet Union became the twin giants of the post-war era. Between them lay a world divided east and west, democracy and communism, freedom and control. The Cold War began not with bombs, but with ideas, a silent struggle for the soul of humanity. And yet, beneath this rivalry, deeper truth remained. Mankind had seen what war could do, and it would do everything to avoid it again. In Europe, the dream of unity took shape. Nations that had once fought for centuries now spoke of cooperation and peace. From the ashes of destruction came the seeds of the European Union, a symbol of reconciliation. In Asia, countries freed from colonial rule found their own voices. India, Indonesia, China, Japan, each charted a new path forward, balancing tradition with transformation. Culture, too, was reborn. Artists, filmmakers, and writers turned pain into poetry, fear into philosophy. They asked questions no one had dared to ask before. How had humanity fallen so far? And how could it ever rise again? Out of that reflection came a new awareness that humanity was one race, sharing one fragile planet. The war had shown that borders were illusions, and that peace was the world's greatest treasure. The United Nations, though imperfect, became a symbol of hope. a place where nations could speak instead of fight. By the early 1950s, the fires of war had given way to the light of innovation. Television, music, science, and culture connected people like never before. A new generation was born, one that had not seen war, but would forever live in its shadow. And as the world rebuilt itself, one truth echoed across the ruins and the stars alike. Humanity had been broken, but not defeated. From blood and ashes, a new age had begun. 80 years have passed since the world's darkest chapter, yet the echoes of World War II still whisper through time. The guns have long been silent, but the lessons of that war remain as urgent as ever. For in remembering, humanity protects itself from repeating the same mistakes. The Second World War was more than a clash of armies. It was a test of human conscience. It revealed both the worst and the best within us. It showed how hatred could consume nations, how silence could become complicity, and how courage even from a single person could change the course of history. From the ashes of Europe to the ruins of Asia, the war left behind more than destruction. It left reminders, memorials, graves, and photographs frozen in time. Each one tells a story of loss, of love, of sacrifice. Rows upon rows of white crosses stretch across foreign soil, silent witnesses to the price of freedom. Every name carved in stone is a reminder that peace is never free. Museums, documentaries, and survivors' voices keep the memory alive. As generations pass, fewer remain who saw the war with their own eyes. But their stories endure not to reopen wounds, but to keep hearts awake. Because forgetting is the first step toward repeating. The Holocaust stands as the world's eternal warning. It was not only a tragedy, it was a revelation of what happens when humanity loses its soul. 6 million lives, extinguished not by war alone, but by hatred, ignorance, and indifference. That memory must never fade, for it is the conscience of the modern world. From that horror came movements for justice, human rights, equality, and dignity for all. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed in 1948, was born directly from the ashes of war. It was humanity's promise that every life matters, that every voice deserves to be heard. The legacy of World War II lives not in glory, but in responsibility. Responsibility to remember, to educate, to question, to stand against tyranny wherever it appears in any century, in any form. The war may have ended in 1945, but the battle for humanity never does. It continues every time we choose peace over violence, truth over lies, compassion over cruelty. The greatest victory of mankind was not defeating an enemy, it was rediscovering its own humanity. As the last survivors fade into history, their message remains eternal. Remember what we endured, so that you never have to. And so, from the silence of the graves and the pages of history, one truth rises. The past is not gone. It is our guide. If humanity remembers, it will endure. If it forgets, it will begin again, the same dark path. Because in the end, the true battle, the battle for humanity, is never over. History moves forward, but some stories never fade. World War II ended generations ago, yet its spirit, the struggle, the pain, the courage still burns within humanity. This is not just the story of armies and nations. It is the story of the human heart, tested, broken, and reborn through fire. The world that emerged from the ashes of 1945 was forever changed. Borders shifted, empires crumbled, and power redefined itself. But something deeper had transformed mankind's understanding of itself. For the first time, the world truly realized what it meant to be one species, sharing one fragile home. The veterans of that war grew old. Their hands, once steady with rifles, trembled now with age. But in their eyes remained the memories of those who never returned. They carried the legacy of their fallen brothers, not as glory, but as duty, to remind us all that peace is not a gift, it is a responsibility. Across the world, memorial flames burn in Berlin, in London, in Moscow, in Hiroshima. They flicker silently, day and night, as if whispering to the future, remember us. Remember what it cost. Each light represents not just death, but endurance, the proof that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, Humanity refused to die. The spirit of that generation lives on in every act of kindness, in every stand for justice, in every voice that says no to tyranny. Their war was not fought for conquest, but for the very soul of humankind. And though their time has passed, their lessons burn brighter than ever. We live now in the world they dreamed of, a world connected by technology, divided by politics, yet still yearning for peace. The same question echoes through time. Will we remember what they taught us? Or will we let history repeat itself once more? The answer lies not in governments or armies but in us, in every heart that values truth over hatred, love over fear, peace over pride. The war showed us how easily the world can fall, and how miraculously it can rise again. The soldiers, the mothers, the survivors, they are gone, but their spirit remains eternal. It lives in our freedom, in our choices, in the quiet courage of ordinary people. As the final chapter closes on the greatest conflict in history, one flame still burns, the flame of humanity, and as long as we keep it alive, their sacrifice will never be in vain. Because the true victory of World War II was not won on the battlefield. It was won in the hearts of those who chose to rebuild, to forgive, and to hope again. Time moves on, but memories do not fade so easily. As the decades pass, the last witnesses of World War II grow fewer with each year. Their voices tremble now, but their words carry the weight of history, the living bridge between our present and humanity's most painful past. These men and women were not generals or kings. They were soldiers in muddy trenches, nurses on blood-soaked floors, children hiding beneath shattered roofs. They were ordinary people, caught in extraordinary times, and through their eyes, we see the truth of what war really means. Each survivor tells a story that no textbook can capture, a story of fear, loss, resilience, and above all, hope. A British soldier remembering the beaches of Normandy, a Russian nurse recalling the siege of Leningrad, a Japanese child describing the day the sky turned to fire. Their voices, though aged, still tremble with emotion, echoes of a world that burned, and a humanity that refused to die. As the last generation that lived through that war fades, their mission becomes ours, to listen, to record, to remember, because when they are gone, only their stories will remain, and it is those stories that keep the truth alive. Museums and documentaries preserve their faces, their letters, their whispers from the past, old photographs, crackling audio tapes, and fading film reels, fragile pieces of memory that hold the world's conscience. Every testimony is a warning, every tear a reminder of what happens when hate rules the world. For the survivors, peace was not the end of war. It was a lifetime of remembering. They built new lives, families, and futures. But the past always walked beside them. Some never spoke of it again. Others dedicated their final years to telling their story, hoping that the next generation would understand what they had endured. Their courage is not in surviving the war, but in reliving it so others may learn. They turned trauma into teaching, pain into purpose. They became the world's memory, human testaments to both the cruelty and strength of mankind. Now, as the last witnesses grow old, a new responsibility falls upon us, to carry their message forward, to ensure that the story of World War II remains not just history, but a lesson. Because when the last witness is gone, history will depend on what we remember, and if we forget their words, we risk repeating their pain. The last witnesses remind us of one simple truth: peace is fragile, memory is sacred. As long as we truly listen, their voices will never die. History moves forward, but some stories never fade. World War II ended generations ago, yet its spirit, the struggle, the pain, the courage still burns within humanity. This is not just the story of armies and nations. It is the story of the human heart, tested, broken, and reborn through fire. The world that emerged from the ashes of 1945 was forever changed. Borders shifted, empires crumbled, and power redefined itself. But something deeper had transformed mankind's understanding of itself. For the first time, the world truly realized what it meant to be one species, sharing one fragile home. The veterans of that war grew old. Their hands, once steady with rifles, trembled now with age. but in their eyes remain the memories of those who never returned. They carried the legacy of their fallen brothers not as glory, but as duty, to remind us all that peace is not a gift, it is a responsibility. Across the world, memorial flames burn in Berlin, in London, in Moscow, in Hiroshima. They flicker silently, day and night, as if whispering to the future, remember us. Remember what it cost. Each light represents not just death, but endurance, the proof that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, humanity refused to die. The spirit of that generation lives on in every act of kindness, in every stand for justice, in every voice that says no to tyranny. Their war was not fought for conquest, but for the very soul of humankind. And though their time has passed, their lessons burn brighter than ever. We live now in the world they dreamed of, a world connected by technology, divided by politics, yet still yearning for peace. The same question echoes through time. Will we remember what they taught us? Or will we let history repeat itself once more? The answer lies not in governments or armies, but in us. In every heart that values truth over hatred, love over fear, peace over pride. The war showed us how easily the world can fall, and how miraculously it can rise again. The soldiers, the mothers, the survivors, they are gone, but their spirit remains eternal. It lives in our freedom, in our choices, in the quiet courage of ordinary people. As the final chapter closes on the greatest conflict in history, one flame still burns, the flame of humanity, and as long as we keep it alive, their sacrifice will never be in vain. Because the true victory of World War II was not won on the battlefield. It was won in the hearts of those who chose to rebuild, to forgive, and to hope again. Time moves on, but memories do not fade so easily. As the decades pass, the last witnesses of World War II grow fewer with each year. Their voices tremble now, but their words carry the weight of history, the living bridge between our present and humanity's most painful past. These men and women were not generals or kings. They were soldiers in muddy trenches, nurses on blood-soaked floors, children hiding beneath shattered roofs. They were ordinary people, caught in extraordinary times, and through their eyes, we see the truth of what war really means. Each survivor tells a story that no textbook can capture, a story of fear, loss, resilience, and above all, hope. A British soldier remembering the beaches of Normandy, a Russian nurse recalling the siege of Leningrad, a Japanese child describing the day the sky turned to fire. Their voices, though aged, still tremble with emotion, echoes of a world that burned, and a humanity that refused to die. As the last generation that lived through that war fades, their mission becomes ours, to listen, to record, to remember, because when they are gone, only their stories will remain, and it is those stories that keep the truth alive. Museums and documentaries preserve their faces, their letters, their whispers from the past, old photographs, crackling audio tapes, and fading film reels, fragile pieces of memory that hold the world's conscience. Every testimony is a warning, every tear a reminder of what happens when hate rules the world. For the survivors, peace was not the end of war. It was a lifetime of remembering. They built new lives, families, and futures, but the past always walked beside them. Some never spoke of it again. Others dedicated their final years to telling their story, hoping that the next generation would understand what they had endured. Their courage is not in surviving the war, but in reliving it so others may learn. They turned trauma into teaching, pain into purpose. They became the world's memory, human testaments to both the cruelty and strength of mankind. Now, as the last witnesses grow old, a new responsibility falls upon us, to carry their message forward, to ensure that the story of World War II remains not just history, but a lesson. Because when the last witness is gone, history will depend on what we remember, and if we forget their words, we risk repeating their pain. The last witnesses remind us of one simple truth: peace is fragile, memory is sacred. As long as we listen, truly listen, their voices will never die. The war ended long ago, but its spirit lives on in stone, in song, and in silence. Around the world, Memorials rise like whispers of memory, reminding us of those who gave everything so that others might live free. This is the age of remembrance, a time when humanity looks back, not with hate, but with gratitude. Every nation carries its own scars, and each honors its fallen in its own way. In Normandy, white crosses stretch endlessly toward the horizon, each one a silent name, a frozen moment in history. In Hiroshima, a single flame burns beside the river, glowing day and night, promising that the world will never again see the sky turn to fire. In Berlin, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe stands in solemn silence, a sea of gray stone, where every shadow is a story untold. From London to Moscow, from Warsaw to Manila, people gather each year to remember. Flowers are laid, bells toll, and heads bow in silence. For a brief moment, the world stands still, united not by war, but by remembrance. In the decades since 1945, remembrance has become more than tradition, it has become a duty. Schools teach the history, films capture the struggle, museums preserve the truth. The faces of those who fought and fell stare back from photographs, their eyes asking only one thing of us: do not forget. Modern generations, born into peace, often cannot imagine the terror their grandparents faced. But every monument, every wreath, every flicker of candlelight bridges that gap between past and present. They are not just symbols, they are promises. Promises that the world will honor its dead by protecting the living. Art and music have also become forms of remembrance. Songs of loss, films of courage, and paintings of destruction keep the emotions alive. Each creation speaks in a universal language, the language of memory. Because remembrance is not only about looking back, it is about carrying forward the lessons that were paid for in blood. For those who survived, remembrance is personal. It is the face of a friend who never came home. It is the echo of a voice lost on a battlefield far away. And yet, amid the sorrow, remembrance is also hope-proof that their sacrifice was not in vain. When we remember, we give the fallen life again, not in body, but in spirit, in words, in legacy. As long as their stories are told, they never truly die. The age of remembrance reminds us of one eternal truth: peace exists only when memory endures. And so, every flame lit, every flower laid, every silence held, is not just mourning the past, but protecting the future. Peace, it sounds simple, almost fragile, yet behind every moment of peace lies a price paid in blood, sacrifice, and silence. World War II taught humanity that peace is not a gift handed down from the heavens. It is something earned and protected by those who understand what war truly costs. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world breathed for the first time in years, but that breath came through tears. Tens of millions had perished: soldiers, civilians, children, and the innocent. The cities were gone, the earth was scarred, and entire generations were changed forever. The world had won peace, but at an unbearable price. The lesson was clear: war is easy to begin, but almost impossible to end. Behind every flag, every ideology, and every speech about glory, there are graves endless, silent reminders that victory in war is not triumph, but tragedy. And yet, peace is fragile. Even after the war, nations clashed in words and weapons of fear. The Cold War, the arms race, the threat of nuclear annihilation, they were all shadows of that same human flaw: the hunger for power. But from those fears also came wisdom. Leaders began to understand that real strength lies not in domination, but in restraint and dialogue, cooperation, and the courage to forgive. The world began to build institutions that could protect peace: the United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, and countless treaties, born from the ashes of destruction. For survivors, peace was not just the absence of war. It was rebuilding homes, families, and hope. It was the laughter of children who had never heard the sound of bombs. It was the sight of soldiers laying down weapons to plant seeds. Instead, they knew that peace had to be lived, not just declared. Each generation inherits that lesson and that responsibility to remember what it took to build the peace we now enjoy, and to defend it from ignorance, hatred, and division. Because the moment we forget, history begins again, and the price will once more be paid in human lives. The world still faces conflict and injustice, but the memory of World War II stands as a warning written in fire and ash. Peace is never permanent. It must be protected every single day. The survivors of that time are nearly gone now, but their legacy burns on in the hearts of those who listen. Their message is timeless. Value peace. Guard it, because you may not survive losing it again.